The movie begins in Texas, where a group of shackled, enslaved black people walk, while Ace and Dickie Speck drive them. 2 years before the Civil War in 1858, Django, among the enslaved, separated from his wife, Broomhilda von Schaft. Later, Dr. King Schultz interrupts their voyage, and a German dentist turns to a bounty hunter seeking information. Ace confronts Schultz, who claims to be a traveler searching for the Speck brothers. Schultz aims to buy Django for his knowledge of the Brittle brothers. Assuming the Speck brothers bought them at auction, he questions the enslaved about the Karukan plantation to locate Django. After Django speaks, Schultz illuminates the group with a kerosene lamp. He asks Django about the Brittle brothers, whom Django identifies. Django describes them as former overseers, but Schultz corrects him, asking if he'd recognize them again. However, Ace interrupts, warning Schultz to stop talking to Django like that. Schultz tries to calm Ace, claiming he's just conducting a transaction. Ace refuses to sell Django and levels his gun at Schultz when rejected. Schultz mocks Ace's dramatic gesture and shoots him after a threat. Dickie pins himself to the ground as Schultz approaches, sarcastically apologizing for shooting the horse. Despite Dickie's frustration, Schultz remains calm, urging him to quiet down to finish the conversation with Django. Schultz returns to Django, insisting on a fair price after learning he can recognize the Brittle brothers. Unfortunately, Schultz leaves the others, allowing them to deal with Dickie while Django takes Ace's coat and horse. The following day, Django and Schultz arrive at Daughtry, Texas, drawing attention as Django, a black man, rides a horse. They unexpectedly acquire a bar restaurant as the innkeeper flees at the sight of Django. Schultz reveals his plan to become a bounty hunter, dealing in corpses after the slave trade. This entails transporting dead enslaved people for a bounty. Though Schultz loathes slavery, he sees an opportunity and convinces Django to assist him. Django agrees to help kill the Brittle brothers for his freedom and $75. As they set off, Schultz learns Django is married and intends to reunite with his wife by buying her freedom. Afterward, Django shares that a German raised Broomhilda and speaks some German. She serves as a house slave for the von Schafts. They head to Tennessee and find shelter, planning to infiltrate a plantation with Django posing as a valet. Schultz allows Django to choose his costume. They visit Spencer Big Daddy Bennett's plantation to purchase an enslaved person. Big Daddy agrees, allowing Schultz to order his slave to tour Django. During the tour, Django asks Bettina about the Brittle brothers, but she's unaware. She mentions the Schaffers who visited previously, unknowingly revealing the lead of the Brittle brothers. Ellis Brittle is spotted in the field. Simultaneously, Bettina reveals the two Brittles are at the stable, punishing little Jody. Django rushes to confront them, instructing Bettina to fetch Schultz. He swiftly kills John and relentlessly beats little Raj. Schultz arrives, prompting Django to disclose the Brittles' names. Django directs Schultz to Ellis, allowing him to snipe him across the field. Later, Big Daddy attempts to attack them despite an earlier agreement. Failing to convince him, Schultz ambushes the posse with explosives, outsmarting them with his cart. Fortunately, Schultz gets a bullseye after hitting the carriage, and then gives the sniper to Django to snipe Big Daddy. Afterward, Django and Schultz spend their night eating, and Django eventually talks about his wife. So Schultz happily tells the story of Broomhilda, whom he knows, and entertains Django. Feeling responsible for Django, Schultz tells him he can't let Django go to Greenville in good conscience to save Broomhilda. So, Schultz opens up about the bounty hunting business that Django might like so that he can buy his wife freedom. Django hears about Schultz's offer, wherein Django will work with him through the winter until the snow melts, and then Django will receive a third of Schultz's bounties afterward. Technically, Schultz agrees to help Django, saying he will get Django to Greenville and find where the Germans send his wife. The following day, Django and Schultz return to Texas and begin their first mission, wherein Django rifles Smitty Bacall and keeps his handbill as a memento. Because of that, Django receives his first bounty and eventually practices shooting using the snowman. Afterwards, Django and Schultz spend their winter racking up several rewards before spring, killing many suspects without any struggle. Later, they travel to Mississippi, only to see many enslaved black people on the street. Afterward, they eventually learn that Broomhilda's new owner is Calvin J. Candie, who owns the fourth biggest cotton plantation in Mississippi Candyland. Desperate, Schultz asks how they will get her from Calvin, so Schultz offers an alternative action plan. Instead of buying a horse, they plan to buy a farm. Schultz then suggests that Django will be an expert on Mandingo fighting he hired because his character will be a big money buyer from Dusseldorf and Greenville and buy his way into the Mandingo fight game. Technically, Calvin is the kind of owner that forced his slaves to wrestle to the death in brutal Mandingo fights. After a while, Django and Schultz meet Calvin at his gentleman's club, finishing watching the Mandingo fights, while Django refuses to see them. Afterward, Schultz follows Calvin as he talks to his champion, Fred, attempting to offer $12,000 for one of his best fighters as a pretext for acquiring Broomhilda for a nominal sum since Calvin doesn't want to sell her. Luckily, they get Calvin's attention and even receive an invitation to Candyland. The following day, Schultz excuses himself to Calvin and talks with Django, saying Broomhilda's at Candyland, so he better stay focused on his retribution if he wants to see his wife. Technically, they are taking their route to the place when they suddenly encounter Calvin's slave trackers, who have cornered D'Artagnan, an escapee Mandingo fighter, using their canine dogs. D'Artagnan then pleads with Calvin, saying he can't fight anymore, but he only orders D'Artagnan to go down and talk to him properly. Unfortunately, Calvin discovers that he lost his last fight and eventually embarrasses him by asking if he doesn't know what reimbursement means. Frustrated, Schultz attempts to save D'Artagnan by saying he will reimburse him, yet Django intervenes and prevents Schultz from blowing their cover. Afterward, Calvin stops and approaches Django, asking if he won't mind handling D'Artagnan and that he is ordering the tracker dogs to maul D'Artagnan to death. Upset, Schultz has no choice but to watch D'Artagnan getting eaten by the dogs. Afterward, they continue arriving at Candyland as if nothing happened in the woods. Suddenly, Stephen gets shocked after seeing Django riding a horse with Schultz, so Calvin clarifies that Django is a freeman and orders him to treat them well. Afterward, Schultz favors Calvin to clean up Hildy, Broomhilda's name, because he wants to meet her. Unfortunately, Django hears about their mistreatment of Broomhilda, so he almost takes out his gun when he realizes he must calm himself to buy his wife. To his dismay, Django watches the crying Broomhilda take her to the litter box to clean up. Later at night, Laura Lee delivers Broomhilda to Schultz's room to talk. Afterward, he reminds Broomhilda that he will only speak German, assuming Calvin's slavers listen to them because he will finally reveal their plan to rescue her. Then, he proceeds to secure his offer to buy her as his escort while negotiating the initial deal during dinner. Confused, Broomhilda asks about his friend's identity, so Django eventually shows himself to her. Later at dinner night, Schultz begins entertaining Calvin to accept his deal when suddenly, Stephen, a staunchly loyal and suspicious headhouse slave of Calvin, realizes that Broomhilda knows Django after seeing her get shocked by Laura Lee's comments towards him. So Stephen makes bait by alerting Calvin that he doesn't want to buy Mandingo, but Broomhilda, making Schultz and Django deduce their plan as he chooses to get Broomhilda as a trap. Luckily, Laura Lee saves Broomhilda from Calvin and Stephen's mockery, unconsciously helping Django to control himself, too. Because of that, Calvin favors everyone in the dining area to leave, as he will talk with Django, his lawyer, and Schultz. Afterward, he reveals their plan to buy Broomhilda, so he orders Stephen to bring her out while physically hurting her neck. Unfortunately, Calvin alters the deal at gunpoint to sell Broomhilda for $12,000 instead of the fighter, Eskimo Joe. However, Schultz reluctantly agrees, but when Calvin aggressively threatens them to beat Broomhilda using a hammer, if ever, Schultz refuses to take the deal, leaving him no choice. Schultz gives him the money immediately. Afterward, they finish their deal while waiting for Calvin to provide him with Broomhilda's paper. However, Schultz suddenly had enough of Calvin's arrogance after hearing him say to shake hands with him, or else he will continue killing Broomhilda, shooting Calvin until he dies. So Butch Pooch immediately responds, killing Schultz using his rifle as Django eventually goes on a rampage, shooting back Pooch, Calvin's lawyer, and several of Calvin's henchmen. Django then engages in a gunfight, but surrenders after seeing Broomhilda getting taken by Stephen and Calvin's henchman, Billy Crash, as their hostage. The following day, the vertically chained Django gets tortured by Billy, almost castrating him, when suddenly Stephen arrives, saying that Laura Lee wants to see him. Fortunately, Laura Lee changes her mind about snipping Django, saying she will give him to the LaQuint Dickey people instead. Technically, Laura Lee has no choice but to replace his brother and take charge of the plantation. She also chooses to let Django suffer to death by selling him to the said mining company. Minutes later, Django is en route to the company of his new owner when suddenly he devises an escape plan by attempting to talk with his escort, handling his first handbill to prove that he's a bounty hunter. Desperate, Django feeds them lies by falsely claiming that the men on his handbill are at Candyland, then promises his escorts that he will share the reward money with them. Luckily, Django gets released by his escorts after they believe in him with the help of his co-enslaved men. Then, after his guards give the rifles and dynamite to him, Django eventually kills them and returns to Candyland with dynamite in his hands. Django immediately gets into the place with a horse and kills the trackers on their base first, then proceeds to the barn to recover Broomhilda's freedom papers from Schultz's corpse. Afterward, Django goes directly to the shelter where Broomhilda is getting jailed. Fortunately, Django takes it as an opportunity to save Broomhilda, while Calvin's mourners return from his burial to give respect. Then, later at night, Django kills Lara, Crash, and the remaining henchmen who just got back from the mansion after mourning Calvin's death. Afterward, Django orders the 2 remaining enslaved women to bid their goodbyes to Lara Lee, while Steven, on the other hand, stops him from getting outside. Upon earning his revenge, Django kneecaps Steven as he ignites the dynamite that he already planted all around the mansion, ignoring Steven's cries inside. The movie ends with Django then bidding goodbye to Schultz by tapping his head, planning to avenge him and D'Artagnan, who died from the mauls of Calvin's slave dogs.